Okay, welcome to those of you that have just joined us. It's great to have you all this afternoon. We'll be getting started very shortly. We're just giving people the opportunity to bypass through the lobby and join us this afternoon. Brilliant. Okay, so it looks like we have some more people joining us, which is great. So hi everyone. Thanks again for joining us for our seminar for teachers, lobbying and legislating. This is hosted by UK Parliament and the Political Studies Association. So we're really excited to have you all with us today. And we're really very much looking forward to hearing from our two fantastic speakers. So we have Dr. Nikki Sue of the School of Journalism joining us from the School of Journalism, Media and Culture at Cardiff University, and Chris Clark from the Legislation Office of the House of Lords. Okay, so my name is Rosie. I'm a member of the teacher training team here at UK Parliament. I'm sure we might have worked with some of you before, but it's also lovely to have the opportunity to meet those of you joining us for the first time. So our work is part of a wider offer offered by the UK Parliament Education and Engagement team. So this includes an exciting programme of online sessions, award-winning resources and professional development. So the most recent development for teacher training are our brand new e-learning for teachers modules, which you can complete online at your own pace, and you'll receive a certificate of participation following that. So if you'd like to hear more about all the things that we can offer you to help you in your teaching and in your classroom, please sign up to our newsletter, which you'll hear more about throughout the session and following the session as well. I'm now going to hand over to James, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the Political Studies Association. Thank you, James.
Hi, thank you. So my name is Dr. James Weinberg. I'm a lecturer in political behaviour at the University of Sheffield, and I'm also the lead for schools outreach and engagement at the Political Studies Association. And I want to welcome everyone who's currently on this call, and especially welcome those of you who are teachers and have survived another day in the classroom during this incredibly difficult and challenging time for education. For those of you who don't know or might not already be members of the Political Studies Association, we're the largest learned society for political scientists, people who are just simply interested in politics, and anyone with cognate interests, either in the practical world of politics or inside the classroom in the UK. And we've now been running for over 70 years. And we have a dedicated portfolio of resources and activities designed just for teachers in schools. And if you want to access that, you can get a schools membership from the PSA for just £25. And that entitles you and anyone else in your school to access our resources, whether that's our Seminars for Schools program, where you can ask for an academic to come in and give a lecture or a speech about a certain topic and to discuss that with your students, whether it be our online repository of resources that are linked to curriculum topics, specifically those on the A-level politics curriculum. We also run student competitions with YouGov and the Financial Times. And if you're a member, your students can take part in those. And we have a whole host of free events going on throughout the year, like this webinar and others, such as workshops for young people who are looking to study politics at university. And if you're a member, you get priority booking on those events. So I'd urge you, if you haven't already looked into it, to think about joining our organisation as a schools member. And my colleague Jamie's putting more information in the chat for you. We'd also be really keen to hear from you about things that the organisation could be doing so that we're more responsive to the needs of teachers around the country, especially at this difficult and challenging time. So whether you're a member or not, please feel free to get in touch with us, whether that's directly to me or through the PSA, and contact details are available on our website. We'd love to hear some ideas from you. But today, we're delighted to be partnering with the Parliamentary Education Service again to deliver what is our second online webinar of this lockdown period. And today we're focusing on legislating and lobbying. And we're thrilled to have Dr. Nikki Sue from Cardiff University and Chris Clark from the House of Lords Legislation Committee to give what hopefully will be interesting and stimulating presentations for all of you, and provide you with some ideas as you go back to your schools and classrooms to deliver your own curricula. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Nikki Stu to give the first presentation, which is entitled Influencing Decisions, Media and Lobbying in Parliament. Thank you, Nikki.
Thanks so much, James. I'm just going to share the screen really quickly, and then can begin. Okay, brilliant. Hi everyone, thanks so much to James for that great introduction. I'm a researcher at Cardiff University's School of Journalism, Media and Culture. I mainly research political communication between representatives and members of the public. I'm particularly interested in looking at the impact of digital technology and how they affect politics, media and society. So today I'll be talking a little bit about media and media and lobbying from the perspectives of MPs. And I'll be sharing some examples from my fieldwork before that I've carried out to illustrate how this process takes place during day-to-day constituency service and work, and how this can and might differ from online and offline experiences. So the importance of media and lobbying cannot be understated. Some examples of successful lobbying recently include Marcus Rashford's campaign in June this year to continue free lunches during the summer. So it's often at election times that we tend to hear about these voices, particularly from charities and different think tanks and institutions. And these matter a lot because they're well placed to spot unintended consequences of proposed changes to legislation and policies, and are able to highlight the gaps that risk leaving sections of our society behind. But outside of election times, their presence in the political system helps ensure government accountability and help make important decisions that have sometimes been overlooked. This can also be carried out in different ways, such as including online tools, such as social media and sites such as 38 Degrees. So since influencing decision-making involves so many different variables and can take place in a variety of ways, I thought I'd focus, like I said before, on the aspect on the sort of the everyday interaction between MPs and their constituents and how this occurs then, and what MPs think of it, and the challenges that they might face when making these policy decisions, and with these in mind. So to illustrate what I mean, I thought I'd share some findings from fieldwork that I actually carried out from 2015 to 2017 for about 18 months. This was a period where I did an ethnography, and I looked at what MPs were doing in the constituency, particularly, especially like face-to-face activities such as surgeries, town hall meetings, and walkabouts. I also carried out semi-structured interviews, and I also collected a lot of different types of materials that MPs were disseminating. So this included traditional materials such as flyers, posters, and social media and online materials that were like blog posts, anything that was members of the public. I also then did an in-depth analysis of interview transcripts. So what I'm hoping by sharing some of these details is that I will be able to give you some insight into how these representatives experience lobbying in an everyday perspective, and their thoughts on this. So to be accessible to their constituents so that they're able to share their concerns and issues really easily. This can be done in a variety of ways, and as I mentioned earlier, I did collect a lot of different types of materials. So on the left, you can see two flyers that were given out by different MPs, one from Lib Dem, one from a Labour MP. And here they're really trying to encourage constituents to get in touch with them by listing the different ways that they can get in touch, at different times these surgeries and appointments are being held. And for example, former MP for Oxford East at the bottom, actually his flyer is also a type of free post, so constituents can actually just write the problems directly on that flyer and just put it in the mailbox at no cost to them at all. So they're really trying to minimize that distance between the constituent and the MP. On the right, Peter Carl MP, who represents Hove, actually tries to do this really physically by actually having his constituency office on the high street of Hove, so that constituents can just drop by whenever they wanted as part of their everyday process to talk about anything they were concerned with. So when I was shadowing him, I actually got to observe this in real life, where constituents who might not have had an appointment could actually drop by and tell them they were concerned about a hospital closing or a GP surgery closing down near where they were living and things like that. And again, really be able to bring up their concerns in an everyday kind of situation. And again, to raise policy questions that they might have. As we have grown to use various platforms and digital technologies to connect with our own friends and networks in our everyday lives, so have MPs. So the accessibility has then been extended to the realm of online tools such as social media. This is particularly important at this critical period of the pandemic, where constituents and MPs are actually not able to meet face-to-face as they would in the examples I've just shown you earlier. But in fact have had to kind of harness these online tools to make that connection. So these include the use of Twitter and Facebook. And here we have some examples of MPs on Facebook. On the front, we've got Robert Halfon MP, who represents Harlow and Essex. And again, we have an example of a policy issue on the left from Peter Kyle that he wrote just a couple of weeks ago about cycling lanes being introduced in Brighton and Hove to encourage environmentally friendly modes of transport. So he actually received almost 900 comments that engaged with his post. He wrote something quite lengthy to express his thoughts about why it was important, but understood that it was something that might affect other people's lives, including car drivers. During my time shadowing him, he actually did express how he felt like this was a really important avenue for him to connect with his constituents, to hear about how they were feeling and have them feedback about their policies in greater numbers. But at the same time, he was also aware that these views only represented a small group of the public, and was very cautious to say there's 900 people said this and therefore everyone in Hove must have felt the same way. Similarly, a lot of the MPs that I did shadow, which I should have mentioned before, I shadowed 10, they did express this sort of concern that a lot of, whilst using social media was a great way to engage and hear about policy concerns and issues, there was a sense that they had to be careful not to generalize the findings from these, because, you know, what about the people they didn't hear from and things like that. More and more MPs are also inundated by letters and emails from those by mass campaign sites such as 38 Degrees and change.org. But petitions are actually also now being able to be made directly with the government using so we can create and sign a petition to ask for a change to the law and government policy, which I understand is a bit more preferred to the MPs I've spoken to now. So after 10,000 signatures, petitions can get a response from government, and after 100,000 signatures, then these petitions are then considered for debate in Parliament. So from my research field, it was actually really clear that out of all the different ways that I've just mentioned that MPs could hear about policy concerns from their constituents and members of the public, their preference was to hear directly from constituents, and importantly for them to actually raise, you know, important legislation to them, either in a letter or hearing face to face. It was paramount for them to note it down as they were hearing it on their walkouts and things like that. So from the Conservative MP's quote on this slide, he actually mentioned how you've got to speak to as many people as possible to be effective. You have to really appreciate what their concerns are, and, you know, allow them to understand that they could influence decision making by sharing these thoughts with you. And he acknowledges that these immediate problems are affecting their day-to-day lives. And one of the things that really emerged from my experiences shadowing them was that MPs were very concerned with what was happening with constituents' everyday lives, because they were actually a reflection of what was happening with, you know, policies that were actually being made on a more macro level, but they were experiencing what was the after effects of these policies being made, and they could then actually reflect and report back on how that was affecting their Similar for the Labour MP quote at bottom, people do raise things and I note them all down. And everything that's being raised is followed up with an issue in action, so a letter in action. So again, very important to them to actually hear about it because they would like to be able to engage with it further. But what about those people who connect with them online? One of the things I actually did ask about during my time shadowing them and interviewing the MPs was how they felt about online petition sites such as 38 Degrees. There was a general concern that it was a good way for people to express their thoughts, but there might be a disconnect between those who sign up on these petition sites and those who actually, whose lived experiences these actual petitions do impact. So one of the main things that was a concern for some of the MPs was that you hear a lot or you get flooded in your inbox, but then you don't actually hear about the specific issues from their own personal point of view because it is a template letter that they're receiving. So they don't really have an idea of how much they're actually being affected in this collectivism style of showing support for issues. So they don't really find this necessarily a very good or useful form of engagement because they receive a template letter and then they then often send a fairly standard reply back, so resulting in an exchange that's not necessarily incredibly meaningful and impacts policy in the long run. There was also some concerns being raised that it could then, be using up resources that could then be directed to more pressing policy issues raised by other members of the public. So, for instance, you can see here in these MPs' quotes is that they do say that it's quite a large number. They flood their MP boxes, but they have to bear in mind that it doesn't necessarily reflect everybody. And interestingly, we have another MP, the Labour MP at the bottom, who does reflect a slightly different view, which says, I'm happy for them to get in touch with me because I will have a way of getting back in touch with them in the future, even if it's not necessarily something that I can really do anything about if it's a big problem with a very standard email. But if they care about it and I respond to them really quickly, then people then tend to get quite impressed. So he uses that as an opportunity to get in touch with them. Just on a point about, going back to the point about directing resources away from those or directing attention away from problems. These sentiments actually echo those who do work in social change. So for instance, a 2013 report by those from the Social Change Agency actually found that the new methods like these online petition sites of online campaigning, such as email your MP tactics, tend to drown out some of the most marginalized people. And this does continue to be a concern for MPs, particularly when they are aware that those who are most marginalized do not necessarily have the means or knowledge on how to raise their concerns. So, yeah. And finally, I'd like to discuss some of the challenges that might also impede the influence that these decision-making can take place, not necessarily intentionally, but due to challenges faced by those who do make them. So firstly, it's just the sheer volume of demands, especially across platform activities. As we mentioned earlier before, their inboxes are being flooded. So just to give you an example of how the amount of correspondence MPs receive from constituents have increased dramatically. Since the 2010s, MPs receive an average of approximately 29,000 emails, 12,000 letters, and 6,000 calls a year. So having one person and usually 3 or 4 caseworkers having to address all that can be quite demanding. Along with these demands are also this balancing act that the MP has to do between responsibilities in Parliament and issues being raised. So this includes managing resources such as time and budget in order to evaluate the policies and issues that are being discussed, so that they're assessed not just by metrics, like how many people are actually telling you it's a problem, but actually by impact as well. Furthermore, despite the importance of issues being discussed, if it's a national petition, often MPs aren't necessarily able to address them because their role tends to be prioritizing their constituents, and as such, they're not necessarily able to do anything about that. And lastly, there is no backup MP should health or personal problems emerge. James's research actually has identified factors on this before, and how it could threaten the mental health of MPs whilst they're carrying out this role, because there's so many demands being made of them. This includes increasing expectations on what they have to achieve for the public whilst under great public scrutiny. So there's a lot to think about, I think, when it comes to like media and lobbying MPs, especially in how it affects them on a daily basis. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Nikki. That was a great presentation, and I particularly enjoyed listening to some of your thoughts about how and why MPs particularly struggle when it comes to communicating effectively, either with their constituents or vice versa. So we're going to pass on now to Chris Clark, who is a member of the House of Lords Legislation Committee, and he's going to provide you with some expert guidance on this topic. So take it away, Chris.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Good, I'm taking that as you can hear me. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I really want everybody to stay on the call, but I will promise you this is a pretty esoteric topic, the legislative process in the House of Lords. So hang in there, and I promise there'll be something for everyone. And I look forward to your questions. So I'm now going to attempt to share my screen. I've got some PowerPoint slides. In an ideal world, and the world's far from ideal at the moment, I would have had some time to pare them down a little bit. So I'm going to have to race through them fairly quickly. And if you, and don't worry, it is pretty esoteric, some of it, but I'll try and make it as exciting as I possibly can. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen with you. Okay, very good. That seems to have worked, which is remarkable in itself. Okay, so my name's Chris. I've been working in the House of Lords for over 15 years. I've done lots and lots of different things. I'm clerk of select committees and the committee office at the moment, but I've also been in the legislation office for 2 or 3 years, a couple of years back. So without further ado, I'll skip through these slides and then let's get to questions as soon as we can, because I tend to think that's always the most useful part of these exercises. So these are some of the questions that we're going to be thinking about for the next 15-20 minutes. Who makes the law? What is an act? What is a bill? Apologies if this is all too simple for you, because you're all, as I understand it, have some expertise in this area. So I'll go to my next slide. So if we're thinking about bills and the legislative process, bills become acts which are laws. So a bill is basically a draft law. Sometimes bills are published in draft form before they're published as bills, but that's not too frequent, but that's something we can return to. But there's lots of different species of bills, and it's quite confusing. Most bills are government bills, and they're called public bills because they apply to everybody. And the government sets out their programme of bills in the Queen's speech at the state opening of Parliament each year, although the regularity of that's been a little bit more unsettled, if I can put it like that, over recent years. So they're the kind of meat and drink of the legislative process. It's government bills. And then there's also private members' bills. And what those bills are is they're bills proposed by usually backbench MPs or backbench peers. They're given a little bit of time on the floor of both houses to make their way through the legislative process, but not many become law. Lots of them are published as a kind of barometer, as a kind of exercise in flying a kite to try and get an issue on the agenda. Although having said that, some very significant pieces of legislation over the last 50, 60 years have been private members' bills. I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying that the Abortion Act 67 was a private members' bill. And then there's draft bills, which, as I mentioned previously, some bills are published in draft before they're introduced to one of the two houses. And that's usually an exercise in the government trying to work out if they've got a very knotty policy area. It gives them a kind of extra round of consultation and discussion to try and thrash out what they want to achieve. Private bills, I probably won't go into too much, and they are different to private members' bills. Sort of one does begin to wonder sometimes if we could have slightly different names for these things, but they're bills which are to do with a private interest, and there aren't very many of them. There's one before the House at the moment about Highgate Cemetery. So they're matters which aren't relevant to the nation at large. They are bills to do with private interests. And then hybrid bills, I promised you this would be esoteric, and we've hit hybridity, and I'm only about 4 minutes in. Hybrid bills are a mixture of public bills and private bills. So they're bills where there is a national interest, but also certain sections of the population are affected by the piece of legislation more than others. So the most well-known examples of hybrid bills are the bills to do with HS2. So whilst it is a government plan to have a high-speed rail network which everybody can use, clearly if you're on the proposed route, that bill affects you far more than if you're down in Cornwall, or well away from the line of where the railway is going to go, and that they have quite a different system. But let's stick to the kind of main public bills for the time being. But I'm always delighted to talk about hybrid bills. It's one of my favourite topics, and it's something I do bore my friends with. Okay, run some sources of bills, like where do they sort of come from? So we've alluded to some of this, but green papers and white papers maybe promise legislation. So a green paper is a kind of initial policy document, and then when it's fleshed out and there's more detail and certainty, it becomes a white paper. And a white paper, government white paper, may promise that a bill will be brought forward. There are bills promised in manifestos. As I mentioned, they can be promised in the Queen's speech, and there may be other sources such as an EU directive. There are bill teams in government departments, usually about 10 to 12 strong, and their job is to get the bill through both houses and get it on the statute book. And they also draw heavily on parliamentary counsel, who draft the bills and often draft government amendments, and generally kind of oversee all the kind of legal aspects. And private members' bills, as I mentioned, from backbench MPs, they can originate in both houses. They don't give much time, and it's quite hard to get them on the statute book. And handout just applies to sometimes, it might be the case that government hand out what is essentially a government bill to a backbench member, just to ease parliamentary time, or if it's a very kind of small, specific bill, it's probably felt a good idea to give it to a backbench member who's got a particular interest and let them pilot the bill through the houses. This is just a little slide about devolution. I think it's fairly self-explanatory. So it does slightly kind of undercut the idea of an entirely sovereign parliament, but I think it's now pretty well understood that the parliament would not legislate with regard to devolved matters without the consent of the devolved administrations. Okay. So the structure of a bill, and there's a little bit of text down here in the kind of commentary section, which explains it a little bit more. But it's basically, it has a title, quite obviously, has a long title which sets out the scope. Clauses of what will become an act are known as clauses in a bill. They become sections once the bill becomes an act. No one please ask me why. I've never really understood. It also has lots of schedules which sit at the back of the bill, where quite a lot of the detail is often found. And whenever any bill is introduced, you always get a human rights compatibility statement, and there's also explanatory notes prepared by the relevant government department, which are very factual and just help to decode what the bill is trying to achieve. Now we'll skip on to this maybe slightly confusing chart, but this is what we all use. And it refers to the stages in both houses up to the point when bill becomes law after it's got royal assent. And they look similar: first reading, second reading, committee report, third, in both houses, but they're different in both houses. Some bills begin in the House of Commons and some begin in the House of Lords. That is business management as much as anything, because if you start them all in one house, then everything gets, you kind of have a log jam, so it's good to start them in different houses. More start in the Commons. You would expect controversial bills to start in the Commons just by an understanding the Commons should have the first go at it. And at the end, the two houses have to agree exactly the same text of the bill for it to become law. And that's when you sometimes get into the process of what is known as ping pong, when the text of the bill moves between both houses until they can agree final text. Pretty complicated ping pong, it can be. And there's a lot of kind of negotiating behind the scenes to and concessions can be given to get the bill over the line. Let's have a little look at Lords' powers. They can introduce bills. They scrutinise. There's the Constitution Committee will always write a report on a government bill, looking at the constitutional aspects of the bill, if any. And there's a Delegated Powers Committee will look at the bill as well to see that it feels that the powers given to ministers under the proposed act are appropriate. Pre and post-ledge we may return to, but that's kind of fairly detailed part of the process. So the Lords can amend the bill. They do constantly. I was just looking in the 2016-17 session, for instance, there were thousands and thousands of amendments considered, and about 2,500 of them were agreed. There might be government amendments and there might be opposition amendments. It's pretty tricky to work out a kind of very, very clear cause and effect. But by and large, I think the kind of main takeaway message would be, and this doesn't get picked up much, it doesn't get much attention, it's often quite boring work, but crucial work, is that bills do get amended regularly and heavily indeed in the House of Lords as it goes about its business of going through the bill line by line. It's easier to amend bills in the Lords because obviously the government doesn't have a majority. It has nothing like a majority. If Labour and the Lib Dems and some of the independent crossbenchers vote together, the government invariably loses. I think it can delay things and make the government think again. Rejecting a bill is something that it would think long and hard about before doing anything like that. The examples are very, very few and far between. And constitutionally, I think most members would think that outright rejecting something that's come from the Commons with the Commons mandate would be a pretty kind of nuclear option. But most of the time, the value is in amending the bill, sending it back to the Commons and saying, are you sure? Have you thought about this? What about that? And then the Commons can reflect on that and then either amend the bill or sorry, agree with the amendment or send it back saying we don't agree. Okay, Lord's stages. Very straightforward. First reading is when the bill is introduced. Nothing happens. It's just read out. The bill's been introduced, although it's a little bit different at the moment because of the way the hybrid house is working. Second reading is about general principles of the bill. There's a speaker's list. It's a big, long debate, depending on how big the bill is. And it's all about general principles. Committee stage is when you really get into the detail. And that's when amendments start getting tabled. And it's very, very sort of forensic examination of the bill line by line. They tend not to vote at that stage on amendments. They tend to use the committee stage to tease out arguments from the government, see what they think of them. And then at report stage is really when you get into the meat of divisions, where they members have coalesced around an amendment or amendments, and they feel as though the arguments they've heard previously have not been sufficient, and they will force divisions at report stage. It's similar in the Commons, but then this is quite a significant difference, is that the third reading in the Commons and the Lords are really quite different. We'll come more to third reading shortly. And then, as I said, after third reading, you then get into ping pong. And next seminar refers to not the next seminar of this particular group. I hate to inform you, but that's something I failed to delete when I was going through these slides, because these are all part of a series of seminars that we run internally. Okay, I'll keep skipping on. Please bear with me. I promised you esoterica. I hope I haven't disappointed. Okay, so there are intervals between bills, and that's to give basically so they don't get rushed through and everybody's got time to read them and think about them and be lobbied about them and receive submissions and draft amendments and all that sort of thing. So there's 2 weekends between first and second reading, 14 days between second reading and committee stage. That's probably the most crucial part, because that's when you've gone from general principles at second reading to the real detail of committee stage. And then on bills of considerable length and complexity, another 14 days between committee and report, and 3 clear sitting days between report and third reading. Fundamentally, this is just to ensure that everyone has enough time. So that's why things don't move at breakneck speed. But I think most members would say there's very strong arguments for having these minimum intervals. Sometimes minimum intervals can't happen if there's any kind of emergency legislation. Often Northern Irish legislation to do with the Assembly or lack of, the bill stages get compressed very, very significantly. Okay, let's have a little bit of a talk about amendments. The Lords has enormous flexibility insofar as any member can participate. And all amendments are called. They're not selected like they are in the House of Commons, by and large. So there's a lot of freedom for members. But there are some restrictions in that the amendment has to be about the bill, and it has to be really quite tightly defined in terms of how it's about the bill. Otherwise, you have all sorts of amendments hanging off a piece of legislation which aren't with what we would call relevant or within scope. Amendments are printed every day, and then before a committee stage or report stage, all the amendments are put into what's called a marshal list, which is basically a big overall Uber running list of all the amendments in order as they come through the bill. And when they're debated, they're grouped, which is to make good use of time. So if you've got 10 amendments all about more or less the same thing, they'll all be taken together rather than having to have 10 separate debates. And that's a nice picture of the Moses Room in the House of Lords, which is a sort of, it's like a parallel chamber. So lots of legislation is dealt with in the main chamber, but just to free up time, some legislation, more uncontroversial legislation, is dealt with in this sort of antechamber. It's just about 10 meters away from the main chamber. It's a bit like, if you know the Commons, it's a bit like Westminster Hall. It's a kind of another way of taking business. Committee stage, I've mentioned this a bit already, but just to skip through, any member can take part. It's very free. The House is self-regulating. Members can talk as many times as they want. It's very discursive. Voting is rare because they wait for report stage. In Grand Committee, which is held in the Moses Room, which we saw that nice picture of a few minutes ago, there's no ability to vote there, which is well understood. Report stage, amendments identical or of identical effect to amendments pressed to a vote by the mover and defeated in committee may not be retabled. So you can't reopen things where a decision has already been made, albeit I've just said that it is rare to vote at committee stage, but that's going to rule the debate. But report stage is where everybody gets organised and decide what they want to vote on, and decide where they're going to keep their powder dry. Third reading, I think the slide says itself, but mainly it's for the purposes of tidying up, attending to the drafting. You might often get government amendments if parliamentary councils notice something in the drafting that just needs some clarifying. But also it's quite important insofar as it enables the government to fulfil undertakings given at earlier stages. So report stage, they might have said, remember, we don't agree with the wording of your amendment, but in principle, we're supportive. Can we take it away and return with our own amendment at third reading? And that happens fairly frequently. So that's why third reading is very kind of useful for things to be swept up. So a few differences between Lords and Commons procedure. In the Lords, there's no formal programming. In the Commons, legislation is programmed, so it starts at a certain time, it ends at a certain time. There's no formal programming in the Lords. There's discussions amongst the usual channels, which is basically the whips of all the parties and the convener of the crossbench peers. And they work out amongst themselves and agree amongst themselves how much time, broadly, the bill's going to be scrutinised. And it's a negotiation, and it's very informal. And it relies on people just sort of being sensible and pragmatic about how long things might take. There's no evidence-taking stage as there is in the Commons, which is when, a bit like a select committee, when external interested parties come and give evidence to the Public Bill Committee in the Commons. They might be academics, practitioners in the field, all sorts of different people. And they would come and give evidence. But that stage doesn't happen in the Lords, I think probably because it's probably thought it doesn't need to happen twice. If it's happened in the Commons, members can read what was said. There's no selection of amendments, as I've already said, like the Commons. Third reading is done on a separate day. In the Commons, it's done straight after report stage, and it's a very, very short debate. And it being now deep into a Tuesday afternoon, I'm going to be bold and skip financial privilege and English votes for English laws, and promise that if there is mass demand, we can return to those another day. This is just a little bit about the Legislation Office and what they do, but there's an awful lot of work at official level to deal with all the different aspects of a bill passing through the House, including printing the bills, drafting private members' bills, working with the department to produce explanatory notes, talking to members about amendments and thinking about drafting and admissibility, and thinking about all the briefs you have to do for the government minister and for who's in the chair. There's all sorts of things around amendments and preemption and duplication. It's an awful lot sort of happens, which it's just never really seen in terms of the kind of machinery of bills progressing. Okay, good system, question mark. This is just speculative. I don't associate any great authority with this. Lots of people would agree or disagree. But the process is good insofar as it's iterative and it's a journey. The bill begins and has its general principles debated at second reading, and gradually through all the different stages, it just gets a kind of fairly rigorous examination, and unintended consequences emerge, or things that hadn't been thought about emerge, or there's some extremely useful lobbying and somebody just brings up something that just hadn't been thought about. So in that way, the kind of process in itself is valuable, and I think flushes out difficulties. I'm sure not always, but the very process and the way in which the timings of and the different stages just gives everyone a reasonable chance to ensure that by the time the bill becomes an act, most things, if not all things, have had an airing. It's on the record, it's in Hansard, you can read all of it at great length, or you can watch it back on Parliament TV. And the outcomes are fairly clear when you have a division, and everyone's on the record, so you can see what's intended. If you're going to argue if it was a less good system, it can be quite repetitive. It is sort of very textual legal, and when you're thinking about divisions, it becomes quite binary. You either agree with them or you don't agree with them, but I can't really think of any particular way around that. So here's some lovely resources. Lord's Whips has lots of information about speakers and groupings of amendments and forthcoming business. There's a Parliament website, which I'm sure you all are aware of, and legislation.gov.uk and LexisNexis print you can find bills, you can find acts going back an awful long way. I see all sorts of, there's been some chat. I don't know if there's any questions directed to me, but for the time being, thanks very much. I hope that was a kind of useful canter through the kind of main foliage of public bills and the House of Lords, and thank you very, very much. I will now stop sharing my screen, and you will all be pleased to know I will mute myself and also take a breath.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Chris. Presuming that everybody can hear me, we will now move to take some questions. And we have one question in our Q&A box so far from Ian Clark. And the question's for you, Chris. And Ian says, Chris mentioned EU directives in relation to the ways a government bill can be introduced. Given we have left the EU but are in a negotiation period, are these directives still influencing bills? Or if not, are they on a timescale until they completely end?
Yes, good question. That example is because these slides are a little bit old, just a year or two. And EU directives in the past have given rise to bills which have become acts, but I can't envisage that that's going to be the case any longer. In fact, I can't think of anything before the House at the moment which is anything to do with an EU directive. So I'm afraid that's a little bit of, that's a kind of historical footnote in this presentation. And I think that ship has sailed in terms of EU directives.
Brilliant, thank you, Chris. I think somebody else is in the process of typing a question. Chris Liston has said hello. Hopefully there's a follow-up to that. Oh, here we go. Another question for Chris. Is there a way of gauging how much influence the Lords has on legislation through informal channels, discussions, conventions, etc.?
Brilliant question. It's one that we worry about all the time. The Constitution Unit at UCL have done a lot of work on this. Lots of it's led by Professor Meg Russell. It's really, really hard to measure outputs because if you think of the collision of factors in a minister's mind when they're making a policy choice, there's so many different forces and things coming from all sorts of different places. And sometimes the Lords amend a bill and you think to yourself, would the government have amended it anyway, or were they pushing at an open door? Or have they really made the government do something that they probably didn't want to do? So, I mean, the long and the short of it is it's really, really difficult to work out, and it's not things don't move in straight lines, and working out causality is very, 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 very tricky. I suppose what I would say if I was trying to say something more helpful is that lots and lots of amendments do get passed, and lots of them are government amendments. Much of it depends on the nature of the parliamentary arithmetic. I think someone once said politics is about counting. But in previous sessions where the government had a tiny majority or no majority, then that gives the Lords a lot more leverage to get changes made, because the Commons wouldn't want to go through endless whipping and difficulties with their own members. It's a bit still quite early in this session. I know that began in January, but we've been so disrupted. But with a solid Commons majority of 80, then I think it's probably the case that it's going to be trickier for the Lords to get their amendments to stick. But really good question, one that we worry about and end up tying ourselves up in knots about trying to just work out. If you look at a bill from beginning to end, it's a muddy footpath by the time you get to royal assent. So it's a hard thing to untangle, but many thanks and apologies for that sort of not really a very good answer.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Chris. And I would reiterate that if you want more information on academic studies of the kind of informal influence of select committees or the House of Lords, have a look at Meg Russell's work. Lots of it's open access. She had one study that looked at amendments from select committees, so not the Lords, but select committees and proposals they made dating over a period of 10 years. And she comes up with 6 or 7 ways in which select committees or other actors have informal influences on the legislative process. So take a look at that. Before I ask the next question that's come up in our Q&A box for Chris, I've got one for Nikki as well. And I wondered, Nikki, in your experience of interviewing MPs directly, obviously you've come across a lot of barriers to effective communication between MPs and constituents, and to the transfer of citizens' interest through into the legislative process. Yeah. But I wonder, in your opinion, how responsive do MPs actually want to be? How many of them see themselves as constituency MPs, if you will, that are looking to take citizens' interests and put them into the House, or do they have different ideas?
That's a really great question, because I think over the experience of, being able to shadow MPs but also interview them, I was able to kind of see what they said they were doing versus like what they were actually doing. And what I noticed, I think in general, especially with the newer MPs, so I had a range of MPs who were more veteran, and then there were a few that were recently elected when I was shadowing them. And I feel like the ones who were quite new were very keen on actually trying to get that, whatever that was being said on the ground across, mostly because I think they felt like they wanted to be, in their own words, like the MPs that they never had. And that was the kind of work that they wanted to be doing. I'm not saying that the MPs who are veteran didn't necessarily feel that way, but I think some of them actually had portfolios and other responsibilities. And unfortunately, like sometimes I think that might have overshadowed some of the things that they were actually able to do on the ground, and bringing that to, through the process of actually legislation and things like that. And I think that's the kind of understanding I got with the newer MPs as well, like that's where they wanted to put their energies towards.
Okay, so if there's a potentially a reluctance or an inability to act on citizen interests,
yeah,
what would you recommend to our audience as the area to study when it comes to, for example, successful lobbying efforts? Is it the petition system and the Commons online petition system, or is it more of a focus on the media? What would you suggest?
I think, I think at the moment, especially at a time when we can't probably go see what MPs are doing in real life, I think the petitioning online, for example, especially with the government petition site, might be an interesting way to understand what's actually being raised as an issue. But with individual MPs, I feel like it is not just an understanding of what the general public might be feeling, but in various constituencies, there are going to be different concerns. For instance, there was an MP that I shadowed I spoke to from Cornwall, and there is a very high rate of unemployment, especially amongst the youth there. So a lot of the issues there were about trying to engage with younger people, giving them opportunities to have, internships, really trying to engage with schools and technical colleges to try to give them opportunities to work with different businesses and things like that. So that's very specific to areas like that. And I think it's worth looking at different constituencies and what the kind of problems they might be facing, and looking at the kind of policies that those MPs are then actually raising, because that would be the kind of thing that would interest them and engage with them. So I would probably be more interested or suggest that it might be more interesting to look at specific MPs and the kind of areas that they represent and the kind of problems that those areas actually are facing, rather than something like very generic, like online. I think that. Yeah.
Brilliant. And that might be a really interesting way for some of our listeners and their students to study some of the dynamics of the principal-agent relationship. To what extent are MPs really responsive to local issues and local demands?
Exactly.
Brilliant. We're going to move on to the next question in our Q&A box, which is for Chris. And this question comes from an anonymous attendee who says that the advantage of the House of Lords is that it's an iterative process, but the disadvantage is that it can often be repetitive. What's the difference?
Very good question. I think inevitably, if you have a good iterative process and you ensure that everything gets a really good airing and is rigorously thought about, then inevitably there's going to be some repetition. But equally, it might be the case sometimes you think the repetition goes, it's a bit too pronounced. But no, it's a good question, and there's definitely an overlap, and there's a tension there. You're absolutely right to identify that.
and possibly the same anonymous attendee has said that in the United States, there is a stat that about 2 to 3% of legislation passes and becomes law. Do we have a similar statistic for the UK? And they imagine it's significantly higher. I don't know if you know the answer to that, Chris. I don't have a number off the top of my head, but it's a good question, worth finding out. We can bring that back to the next webinar.
Absolutely, very good question. It must be higher, I would have thought, but I'm not. It's not a number I've ever seen, but that's something that I can take away. Thank you.
Brilliant. So we've got time for a few more questions. If anyone would like to post them in our Q&A box. If not, I'm going to ask the speakers themselves whether they had any questions for each other.
I think someone asked me this question online, but I feel like this is a question I would like to ask Chris, because, you know, I don't know if it's something that he might have the answer to, but are there actually any trends that you observe in your work around the kind of bills when people try to lobby MPs and the Lords? Sorry.
I don't think so particularly. I think members are lobbied ever more. I think their inboxes and their mail are teeming with people making representations, and there's absolutely no shortage of desire from external bodies to make their voices heard. You'd need to ask someone with more closer to it than me, or ideally members themselves, how they feel about the extent to which they're being lobbied and whether or not it's escalated in recent years. Yeah.
We've got another question that's come in, this one from Russell Deacon, who says that we also cover Welsh politics in school. Do you know how, if at all, the Lords processes interact with the Senate? And I presume this question is to Chris.
I think there's little formal interaction. The Senate's procedures I'm not very well aware of, but we do speak to the Assembly obviously from time to time, but no, there's no formal mechanisms between the House of Lords and the Senate that I'm aware of.
Thank you, Chris. And one to Nikki from Stuart Baker, who asks, what amount of online communication to MPs is abusive or attacking their views? And I guess here, Nikki, you might refer to the studies by Sophia.
Yeah, I was about to say that. I think that's a really good question. One of some of the work done by our colleague Sophia, which I will link in the chat later, actually finds that a lot of the abuse tends to be towards women. And well, at least the MPs that I've actually shadowed and interviewed, they do experience a lot of this, but some of them actually have mentioned it, some of it can be quite physical. So one of them has actually been worried because he has been asked, I think, or attacked, or like not necessarily physically attacked, but been trailed by the constituents in their constituency because they saw them tweeting about where their whereabouts were and what they were doing. So they've actually had to alter some of their actual behavior online so that they felt like they were safe, especially because they had children, and you know, a lot of their information's on public records. So one of the things that they actually altered was posting only after events had taken place. So instead of saying I'm currently at this place at this time, which I think, you know, in general they would publicize, but they wouldn't publicize it too much on their social media, they would then post some pictures after it was over, just so that they felt like they were able to feel safe after as well. So I actually don't know how much Sophia has done in terms of publications with that, but I do know that she has found that most women tend to be bear the brunt of the abuse online. Yeah, and this also dissuades more female candidates from actually running as well. That's one of the other findings.
Brilliant, thank you, Nikki. We've got another question, again from an anonymous attendee, who asks, Chris, do you think the House of Lords will ever undergo reform? And if so, what do you think the nature of such reform will be, or the effect it will have on the future legislative process? So just a small question there for you, Chris. What do you make of that?
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm absolutely astonished we've managed to get an hour in without this question coming up earlier. And it's a perennial question, and I'll be very careful about what I say. unless I want to be get myself into some considerable hot water. There are always reform proposals floating around. There have been ever since I've been working in the House, and they've been there long since before. The last kind of biggish attempt was Nick Clegg's bill when he was in the coalition government, and that was to introduce an elected element at least, and that never made its way out of the House of Commons. It was in 1999, Blair's first government, when probably the last kind of really quite significant reform passed through, and that got rid of all but 92 hereditary peers. Since then, there's been bits and pieces, like there's now capacity for members to retire, but it's a perennial subject. Again, something that Meg Russell at the Constitution Unit writes about quite a lot. There's nothing really substantive on the table just at the moment, but I suspect it's the discussion that will run and run, and it's been it gets talked about on rainy afternoons, I think, and people dust off their proposals. The problem is, and this is a really simple point, but people don't agree, and if people don't agree, it's going to be quite hard to get something passed. There's a whole spectrum of opinion, and parties don't particularly agree altogether either. I mean, lots of elements of parties do, but there are outliers in this debate, and there's no consensus. And until you have some consensus, then the debate will doubtless rumble on.
And would you say, Chris, in your opinion, is the House of Lords a valuable feature of the British legislative process at the moment?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it just does lots of really detailed, painstaking work, which rarely makes its way into the kind of the press or the media. Lots of its committees get very, very good coverage. There's been good coverage this year of some big inquiries into social and economic impact of the gambling industry, for example, which is still getting a lot of coverage and is a big, big topic. The Constitution Committee is highly regarded, as are EU Committee in Economic Affairs, S&T, the list goes on. So there's a lot of very, very good detailed expert work happening, and lots of the in select committees, and in the world of bills, to go through bills deep into the night, line by line, when everyone's long since gone to bed, has to be valuable, I would have thought.
Brilliant. Another anonymous attendee has asked, Chris, what happened to the Salisbury Convention during the coalition government? Did the House of Lords transfer the principle from the winning party's manifesto to the coalition agreement? Was it something that much thought was given to?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think that must have been probably what happened by default, even if it was never articulated as such, that they looked at the coalition agreement rather than the winning party's manifestos. Whether or not it was given much thought, I don't know. Sorry, with everything that's happened in the last 5 years, the coalition government seems like an absolute lifetime ago. So sorry not to be able to recall or give you a better answer than that, but thank you.
It absolutely does, doesn't it? So much has happened. Nikki, maybe another question for you. In your experience of interviewing MPs and thinking about lobbying and influencing legislative decisions, can you think of any particularly successful examples of times that either MPs themselves have managed to influence the legislative process, or when groups of citizens or individual citizens have affected it via their representatives?
Oh, I'm not sure anything comes to mind at the moment, but what I do recall is one of the MPs actually telling me one of their success stories. I don't think it necessarily was passed, but it was actually discussed, and they brought the constituents to Parliament. But I believe it was the same MP I was discussing in Cornwall, who talked about a lot of the businesses in Cornwall actually closing or being affected because there's just not that many people there. So quite a few pharmacists actually got together and talked to him about why it was really important to maintain local pharmacists in the area, especially if there weren't any clinics and things like that around, because that's where constituents and especially like elderly people and things like that were able to actually access their medication. So he took it quite seriously because he realized it affected more than just this group of people and their jobs, but the community at large, and actually helped them with bringing their concerns to Parliament and have them meet the Minister of Health at the time to talk about it further and discuss it. So he didn't necessarily imply that it did pass anything else unsuccessfully, but what he did tell me was that he did take it very seriously because he realized there were larger implications than just the small group of people who came to talk to him about these things, which I think is what I meant earlier in my presentation about like impact versus just like hearing a lot of people, a lot of noise about a problem, but recognizing that some of these issues that are being raised to them in some of these more local lobbying, smaller everyday experiences, actually understand how it affects the society around them rather than just that group of people.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to invite any of our listeners to post a final question or two in the box now, and I'll give you a minute or so to do that. And if there are no questions, then we can draw the webinar to a close. So I'll give it 30 seconds or so and see if anyone has anything they'd like to ask.
Can I just fill the 30 seconds with just a thought? I'm inspired by what Nikki was saying.
Absolutely.
It's a really good example of something that happened fairly recently, whereby law basically, which came from an individual person's circumstances, and when they lobbied really heavily for it and did excellent campaigning and media work, was the upskirting law, which became the Voyeurism Offences Act 2019. And I've heard that woman speak, whose name I apologise, I can't remember now, but that really was an amazing example of one person being subjected to something that they found totally unacceptable, and deciding to really lobby hard, campaign, get in the press, talk to MPs, talk to peers, talk to ministers, and it got royal assent.
Yeah. Wow. I just looked it up. Gina Martin is that person you're thinking about? Amazing.
That's right.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for reminders of that, Chris. Oh, we have got a question. So we'll take this as our final question. This one for Nikki. Is there any requirement for MPs or their teams to respond to communications from constituents? Could they theoretically never respond to anyone?
I think theoretically they don't have to, but they do. I think that they aim to do that. All of the MPs that I have, from my understanding, is that they make it a point to ensure that everyone gets a reply, even if it takes a longer time for them to respond. So often you get an automatic response to say that your reply has been received, and then they do tend to reply to the constituents. I think it's also very important to note that because there are so many ways you can get in touch with the MP now, especially on Facebook and Twitter, like I mentioned earlier, MPs tend to have to check that these people who are getting in touch are actually their constituents before they invite them to send an email or get in touch in other means. So it is something that they strive to do, even though it's not actually something they're like technically required to do, but they all tend to do that and get in touch. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Nikki. So we seem to have exhausted the questions from our Q&A box.
Yeah.
And with that, I would like to extend my thanks and the thanks of all of our listeners. Thanks from the PSA and the Parliamentary Education Service to you, Nikki, for your wonderful presentation on influencing decisions, and also to you, Chris, for guiding us expertly through the legislative process in the House of Lords. So I wish all of you the best of luck for the forthcoming semester and the rest of this term, for those of you who are teaching in schools. And I look forward to seeing or hearing you either in person or online again at a future PSA event.
Thank you so much, James, and everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.